much, Hannes, Bayo, and Nick there for the invitation. Should I use the microphone or is it okay like this?
It's fine.
It's fine. Okay. So thank you very much for being here. My talk, as you can see, is entitled Latent Spaces, Generative AI, Art, and the Transformations of the Archive. And it is based both on my research on the impact of AI technologies onto images, visual culture, and contemporary artistic practices, but also on my work as a curator of this exhibition in Paris that was already mentioned, and of a new one that will be presented in Lisbon next year. So my talk will constantly intertwine to different lines, so to say, responses to the exhibition, and also more theoretical issues having to do with the concept of latent spaces and the role that latent spaces play in the processing of the past, of memory, and of the archive. So I begin with the first part, which is focused on the exhibition at the Jeu de Paume, and which is entitled So AI. The exhibition presented in Paris, on which you can see here some views, intertwined two different registers, which will be present also in its further iterations in Brazil and in Germany. On the one hand, first a register composed by a selection of works by about 30 artists, among whom Trevor Paglen, Tito Steyer, Agnieszka Kurant, Gregory Chatonsky, Kate Crawford, and Vladan Joler, and others, who during the last 10 years have tackled the question of what it means to experience the world through AI. In other words, what it means to perceive, imagine, think, remember, forget, work, write, produce images and sounds in a world more and more infiltrated by AI models that are penetrating across all layers of culture and society. These works were distributed across all the spaces of the Jeu de Paume in 10 different sections. On the first floors, visitors would encounter sections entitled Materials and Environments, on the question of the material and environmental dimension of AI technologies, and then sections entitled Collective Intelligences, Cartographies of AI in Space and in Time, Machine Vision, Face and Emotional Recognition, and Micro-Labor. On the second floor, instead, the visitors found sections entitled In the Latent Spaces of History, very much connected to what I'll be talking about today, Words and Images, on the ways in which AI models today are transforming, reorganizing algorithmically relations between words and images, and then sections entitled Photorealism and Generative Writing. And this section in particular was taken care of by one of the associate curators, Alexandre Gessen, who's a specialist of the AI and literature. The second register of the exhibition was instead composed by a series of 7 time capsules, that is, glass vitrines organized as cabinet de curiosité, aimed at positioning the current transformation caused by AI in a historical and genealogical perspective. Each time capsule gathered a constellation of objects, photographs, books, diagrams, and technical devices, which, in the version of the exhibition presented in Paris, came from archives and collections stored in various institutions in the city. Conservatoire des Arts et des Métiers, the Cinémathèque Française, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the Musée de la Préfecture de Police, and so on. To give some examples of these time capsules, one of them tackled the question of the connections between the current face and emotional recognition systems and the history of physiognomics, with its different artistic, psychological, social, and racial dimension. Taking as a starting point the work of Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglen on the politics of face and emotional recognition datasets, both in essays such as Excavating AI from 2017, and in works such as ImageNet Roulette, the work that showed all the problematic classifications generated by face recognition systems trained with the ImageNet dataset. I prepared a vitrine in which visitors could find works by the 17th century painter Charles Lebrun, some of the plates with facial diagrams of emotions accompanying the text of his conference on the expressions of passions in 1668, but also the composite portraits of Francis Galton and H.P. Baldwin, whose very appearance strangely recalls that of the AI systems of face recognition called eigenfaces, and then classifications of faces and facial traits, Cameroso's L'Uomo delinquente, Criminal Man, 1889, and Alphonse Bertillon, Tableau synoptique des traits physionomiques pour servir à l'étude du portrait tablé, the spoken portrait of 1900. The idea within this time capsule was to highlight for the visitors of the exhibition the well-known fact that these centuries-old traditions of physiognomics, phrenology, and criminology have left important traces in the analytic criteria and the taxonomies that structure some of the main data sets that are used to train the recent face and emotional recognition systems. Another time capsule in the Paris exhibition visualized instead the relations between the current systems of machine vision, the history of the attempts to automatize visual perception, and the history of the idea of an eye of the machine. Within this time capsule, visitors could find one of the cameras used by Zigavertov in the 1920s, while he was working on films such as Man with the Movie Camera, and while he was also theorizing the concept of kino glass, kino eye, which was also the title of his first long film in 1924, here advertised by a poster designed by Alexander Rodchenko. Next to these items, visitors could also find one of the cameras used by the French film director Jean Epstein in the years in which he was writing essays and books such as Bonjour Cinéma, L'Objectif lui-même, L'intelligence d'une machine in 1946, and Alcool et Cinéma, a series of texts in which Epstein describes the camera as a metal brain, a non-human eye, without memory, without thought, an eye outside the eye, or, another quotation, a wonderful device to step out of ourselves and of the world within which we thought we were living. In the same time capsule, these ideas circulating in France, in the Soviet Union, and in Germany during the 1920s and 30s, we may think, for example, of the passages by Walter Benjamin on the optical unconscious, or Krakauer's statements in his essay on photography in 1927 about the non-human dimension of photography. Well, these ideas of the 1920s and 30s were connected to the attempts to automatize visual perception in another completely different tradition, the early years of so-called artificial intelligence. Within the time capsule, visitors could see one of the first publications concerning the perceptron algorithm invented by Frank Rosenblatt in 1957, as well as images documenting its first application for pattern recognition, the Mark I perceptron that you can find on the right in 1958. Finally, within this same time capsule, visitors could see Harun Farokhi's 3 video installations entitled Eye Machine 1, 2, and 3 from 2001-2003, a crucial work for its analysis of the epistemic and political implications of machine vision and of what Farokhi used to call operative pide, operational literacy. As it travels through Brazil and Germany, the Jeu de Paume exhibition would not remain unaltered. On the contrary, each time it will be adapted and updated, based on the idea that any discourse on AI is always culturally and geopolitically situated. Organizing an exhibition on AI and contemporary art in Paris, in Sao Paulo, or in Frankfurt is not the same thing, and it will not be in Berkeley if we ever make it to organize it here. For this reason, at each venue, new works, new exhibition sections, and new time capsules will be introduced. In Campinas and Sao Paulo, for example, I decided to introduce a new section entitled Colonial Imaginaries, Decolonial Subversions, in order to highlight the decolonial approaches to AI that are common among Brazilian artists. This is the case, for example, of the installation Botanica Tyrannica by the artist and researcher Giselle Tegelman, an installation which takes as a starting point a study of all the racist, sexist, colonialist, and offensive plant names that appear in the botanical taxonomies established by European explorers in Brazil between the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 20th. Within these taxonomies, we find sexist names such as these. I make you read them. Sometimes I don't even dare pronounce them. Racist names such as these, then worse. Or anti-Semitic such as these. After having studied all these problematic taxonomies, Giselle Begemann used the generative adversarial networks trained with datasets of plant images to visualize imaginary, alternative, unstable, possible plants that do not fall into such really problematic taxonomies. These are just a few seconds of one of the GAN videos that we can see here in this method. In Frankfurt, the new section will be introduced on the theme of AI slop and slopaganda, a theme that has become very apparent in the political landscape over the last few months, with the use of AI-generated images, or better memes, by far-right parties and authoritarian/fascist governments in countries such as the US, but also Argentina, often with the same motifs, as you can see here, Germany with the AfD, Italy with the far-right, are in many, many other countries. A new situation in which cheap, sloppy, meme-like AI-generated images seem to have become the visual language of far-right parties who, instead of denouncing the biases and the stereotypes that appear in such easily generated images, through the default settings of the commercial models, fully embrace such biases and stereotypes. And in this case, in Frankfurt, this question will be tackled through works of contemporary artists, probably still to be confirmed, this new installation by Tito Steyer called The Island, which was just presented for the first time 3 days ago at the Pineapple Nation in Milan. The time capsules will also be entirely remain as the exhibition travels. In Brazil, for example, with the help of local historians, the time capsule connecting face and emotional recognition systems with the history of physiognomics will focus on the intertwinings of physiognomics, eugenics, and racism that developed in Brazil during the early 19th and early 20th century, with the works of figures such as Raimundo Nina Rodrigues, author of Os Africanos no Brasil, published posthumously in 1932, and João Baptista de la Cerdas, author of Sur le métis au Brésil in 1911. This last book is a plea for eugenics and contains a reproduction of a famous painting by Modesto Brocos, Ham's Redemption, which we will try to have in the exhibition in Sao Paulo, and which visualizes the idea of a gradual whitening of Brazilian Black people as a form of social redemption. In Frankfurt, the exhibition will be presented in a building which is a temporary location for the Schirn Kunsthalle, whose traditional building is currently under renovation. This temporary building has a very interesting, stratified, and troubled history. It is called the Dondorf Druckerei, the Dondorf Printing Works, and was built by the Jewish family Dondorf in the 1880s. After being the factory in which game cards and currencies were printed in the late 19th and early 20th century, the Dondorf Druckerei became the site where the social democratic newspaper of Frankfurt, Volksstimme, was published in the late 20s and early 30s, and then the site where the Nazi newspaper Volksblatt was published between 1933 and 1945, before becoming part of the Frankfurt University in the 50s and 60s, the years in which Adorno was teaching there. When the exhibition will be presented in this building between June and September 2026, the time capsule on physiognomics will focus on German physiognomics, from Lavater's Physiognomische Fragmente to August Sander's Antlitz der Zeit, part of his larger project People of the 20th Century, including also the racial physiognomics developed by figures such as Hans Günther in his Assenkunde des deutschen Volkes 1922. Taking into account that the Frankfurt exhibition will be presented in what used to be a printing factory, I will also use one of the time capsules to visualize connections between the history of printing techniques with mobile characters and the current forms of AI text processing, juxtaposing movable types borrowed from the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz with the so-called tokens used by large language models, both being forms of segmentation, standardization, and recombination of linguistic units to enable new forms of textual production, reproduction, and processing. Now, working as curator of these various versions of the Jeu de Paume exhibition in organizing these time capsules is, of course, one way of reflecting on how AI transforms our understanding of the past, of history, and the archive, since in each case I started from the vantage point located in the present, machine vision systems, facial and emotional recognition systems, large language models, and then I tried retrospectively to see how these current transformations invite us to look back at history in a different way. A major reference point for me in doing this was the large diagram by Kate Crawford and Brian Yoler entitled Calculating Empires, a 24-meter long diagram organized into sections entitled Communication and Computation and Control and Classification that try to visualize the multiple intersecting genealogical lines that during the course of 5 centuries, the year 1500, which is the baseline of all the 2 sections, and the year 2025, the top line, have somehow led, beyond any teleology, of course, to the current development of AI technologies. The title, Calculating Empires, highlights the fact that for Crawford and Yoler, AI in its current state is a new form of empire, based on operations of calculation and computation. It is in one of the sections of this vast diagram that we see a connection between the current large language models and Gutenberg's invention of printing through movable type. Another section visualizes a relation between the current generative AI models producing still and moving images and the invention of artificial perspective in the 15th century, highlighting the fact that it was with the invention of perspective that images organized according to grid-like structures became the site of mathematical and geometrical calculations. Now, working on the Jeu de Paume exhibition, another way of reflecting on how AI transforms our understanding of the past developed from the direct confrontation with the artists and artworks I encountered, and from the very study of how generative AI models work. And this leads me to the second part of my presentation, entitled Latent Spaces as Meta-Archives. While preparing the exhibition, I was surprised to see how many artists use generative AI models, both generative adversarial networks and diffusion models, both proprietary models and open source models, not so much to imagine possible futures, but rather to visualize alternative pasts. Training and sometimes fine-tuning these models with materials stemming from different kinds of archives, collections, databases, or from specific areas of the internet, these artists adopt different strategies and pursue different goals. Some question the ways in which AI automatically analyzes, describes, and classifies historical documents in order to expose biases, absences, and erasures, while others use AI to visualize alternative versions of the past, counterfactual histories, fictional memories, trying to fill historical lacunas, to generate missing images, or to shed light on historical blind spots. Considered together, these artistic projects seem to me to be moved by a new widespread impulse in approaching the past, history, and the archive through AI. Not exactly an archival impulse, to quote the title of a seminal essay published by Hal Foster in October in 2004, but rather what I would call today a meta-archival impulse. a desire to explore what the archive is becoming under the pressure of deep learning technologies that operate from a meta level in archive, turning historical material as processable data. The exhibition at the Jeu de Paume, in a section that I already mentioned entitled In the Latent Spaces of History, presented the first selections of these artworks. I mentioned some of them here in chronological order because the dates of the works the artists were working with. First, generative adversarial networks between, let's say, 2017 and 2022, and then diffusion logs. The first work I'd like to mention is Egor Kraft's Content-Aware Studies, a series that began in 2018. The work in which the artist, after having trained a generative adversarial network on a data set of 3D scans of classical sculptures and friezes from the Hellenistic and the Roman period, used the model to somehow repair fragmentary statues or to imagine the possible ones, statues and friezes that might have existed but were never created, as the frieze that you see in the slide, sculpted in marble by a mechanical arm on the basis of the GAN-generated image. The result of this process is what Egor Kraft calls a synthetic history, a speculative exploration of the unrealized possibilities of the past that has been recorded in large image datasets. Second work I'd like to mention, also using GANs, is Nora Al-Badri's Babylonian Vision, a series of 150 videos generated with GANs trained with datasets made of thousands of images of Mesopotamian, Assyrian, and Neo-Sumerian artifacts that the artist scraped from the website of several Western museums and collections after having asked to access these datasets and having been denied access. The videos, which show constantly morphing variations of these artifacts with a typical GAN style that became typical of the artworks generally produced in these years, they show constantly morphing variations of the artifacts, which Al-Badri calls a form of techno-heritage, a way of using generative AI to produce alternative possible artifacts that question the colonial logics that led to the constitution of Western museum collections. The third work I'd like to mention is an installation by Nouvelle Al-Jobaisir, artist based in New York, but of Saudi and Iraqi origins. And the work is called Salaf, Ancestors, an installation in 3 parts that show different ways of dealing with the archive. The artist decided to begin by applying machine visual systems to images stemming from the photographic archive of Gertrude Bell, the British archaeologist, political officer, and contemporary of Lawrence of Arabia, known for having explored the regions between today's Saudi Arabia and Iraq between 1871 and 1926, producing a series of photographic records of Bedouin living conditions. The result of this application of machine vision to such photographs was a series of misclassifications and misunderstandings. For example, the object held by a Bedouin child ends up being labeled a skateboard, or the Bedouin man's clothing ends up being labeled as a military uniform, a mistake probably caused by the fact that the machine visual system Al-Jobaisir used in 2020 had been trained for military purposes. Then, in a further step of her process, the artist scraped an Orientalist collection from the Getty Museum and decided to apply to it a U2-net, a segmentation model, not to trace the contours of the human figures represented in the images, but rather to erase, replacing them with white silhouettes, thereby creating what she calls an absent dataset. This, as the artist explains, became, I quote her, a symbolic act, a refusal to allow certain data to become training materials. Finally, in the third step of the process, Al-Jawazir trained the generative AI model, style YAM3, on this absent dataset, generating new images and new videos that we can see here, that while preserving the white silhouettes, tended also to reproduce the visual patterns and bodily poses that are typically of the Orientalist images with which it was trained. Now, let me move to two works which were produced a few years later using different kinds of models, diffusion models, and not the GANs, which, as we see, tend to produce this kind of morphing as they explore in a continuous way from vector to vector the latent space of the model. The first work I'd like to mention is by a French artist and film director and a writer called Éric Dulot. The title is Cinéma Vivant, Living Cinema, from 2024, which is a series of AI-generated black and white still images which Dulot produced in 2024 using the open source model Stable Diffusion, accessed through a platform called Lexica. The goal for him was to visualize some of the ideas formulated by the symbolist poet Saint-Paul Roux in a series of notes published posthumously with the same title. Written during the 1920s and 30s in the form of prophecies, these notes describe a future cinema, I quote, plastic and alive, which having left behind a two-dimensional screen will fill the world with double, triple, centuple phantasms. By capturing solar energy and thanks to its own inner sun, continues Saint-Paul Roux, capable of vivifying images, this future cinema would be able to produce three-dimensional crystalline images. As the Saint-Paul Roux writes, in the cinema until now, images have been reflected. They will in the future be crystallized. Interested in what he calls a cinéma imaginaire, an imaginary cinema made of unfinished or unrealized film projects, utopian ideas about future media, or cinematic ideas scattered across the history of literature, for example, in the writings of figures such as Raymond Roussel and Fernando Pessoa, studied by Dulot in two of his recent books, the artist uses generative AI as a way to visualize traces of such cinema imaginary that have remained somehow in a latent, non-visual state. Finally, I'd like to mention a very important work in the exhibition, which is Grégory Chatonsky's La Quatrième Mémoire, the Fourth Memory. This is the work of an artist who's also the author of an extremely interesting series of texts on generative AI and its various anthropological, epistemological, and political implications. His installation at the Jeu de Paume positioned the viewer in a future point of view, one that comes after human extinction. On a lifeless planet Earth, fully mineralized by excessive heat, all forms of life, both human and non-human, have disappeared. What is left are only remnants of data centers storing huge quantities of human memories that generative AI systems keep on processing and reprocessing. On a large projection, the visitors saw an endless generative video, always refreshed, whose images never repeat themselves. They are generated by an open source generative AI video model, which has been fine-tuned with images of Chatonsky himself, photos of him, of places where he has been, people he has encountered. What the video visualizes are fragments of possible lives he could have lived. Chatonsky talks about this installation as, I quote him, a posthumous work in my lifetime, not as a monument consecrating what I did, but like a machine pursuing what I could have done. Each generated image is described by an image-to-text model, and the description is in turn read by an AI-generated video. And as soon as a generated image appears, another model goes and searches a real archive, an archive called Visual Contagions, based at the University of Geneva and containing 20 million images stemming from various journals and periodicals throughout the 19th and the 20th century, for archival images that appear on these kind of violet screens that are connected to the generated images by relations of purely formal resemblance. So each time a new image, generated image appears there, the model searched without any metadata, just based on pure resemblance for images in the archive that somehow resemble the generated ones. And here is a 2-minute fragment of the video. In this case, I show you only fragments of the generated video that appeared on the wall.
Les façades blanches se dressent, immaculées, comme les fantômes de pierre. Peut-être ai-je déjà marché ici, il y a longtemps. Les fenêtres rectangulaires me regardent fixement, leurs reflets vacillent sous le ciel clair. Est-ce un souvenir pour une illusion? Le sol pavé gris sous mes pas, chaque dalle résonne comme un écho du passé. Un homme assis. Devant lui, des feuilles blanches, souillées, gondolées, amassées en un tas hétérogène. La bouche dissimulée sous un étiquetage adhésif. Brun clair coin. Les yeux fixent les feuilles, et peut-être la caméra.
It's a popular Shinharimo at the temple.
Lorsque nous prenons en compte la nature de notre implication dans la machine et la nature paradoxale de la technique elle-même, leur signification négative semble constituer un pas au-delà de l'ordre que nous avons imposé à l'ensemble de la nature. C'est un acte qui me laisse ressentir 1000 choses. La douleur de la lame casseuse, l'or qui monte dans le cri des poissons de la mer, le froid quand je vois les résultats.
Okay, so what you just saw is a simple 2-minute recording of a video that actually lasted for the entire duration of the exhibition without ever repeating itself. It's a fully automated system in which Katunsky fine-tuned a version of Stable Diffusion used to generate moving images. It's called animated. He also found a way to automatically generate prompts that would generate these small segments. And then he had an image-to-text model that produced the texts that analyze these images. The image-to-music model that produces the music that every now and then appears. And an AI voice that creates the text. So the artist has fine-tuned the model and initiated the process, but then in a way, this whole process unfolds almost automatically for the entire duration of the exhibition. And the viewers had this experience, which is becoming more and more rare, of seeing images that you would never see again. Now, I had the privilege, because I know the artist, to obtain this recording, but otherwise, as a visitor, you are submitted to a visual flow that never repeats and is lost forever, which is a kind of strange situation in a culture more and more characterized by the recording and the replayability of all visual content. Now, during the last few months, while preparing the next iterations of the Jeux de Paume exhibition and a new exhibition project that will be presented at the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology in Lisbon next year, I've encountered many more artistic projects that adopted similar strategies in order to re-explore different kinds of archives. Historical archives, museum collections, family archives, photographic archives, team archives, scientific and botanical archives, or areas of the internet itself treated as a massive, disorderly, decentralized archive. I have now a list of about 50 artistic projects that work in this perspective, and the list keeps on going. It's quite... Now, works like this, I believe, are a powerful reminder of how AI technologies are transforming profoundly our relation with the past. The reconstruction of the past has always been a contested ground and has always been somehow technically mediated. AI currently introduces a further layer of algorithmic mediation, which has its own specificities and may end up reshaping historicity itself. And by historicity, I mean here the technological and epistemological conditions under which history becomes thinkable, visible for the narrator. The AI models contemporary artists are using for these re-explorations of the past are very different, but they all have some key features in common. They all perform in different ways a common series of operations, that of compressing high-dimensional data, such as images, text, voices, and sounds, digitized and rendered in machine-readable form, into lower-dimension vectors, embedding them in latent spaces where the models perform computations using tensors. And tensors are multidimensional mathematical arrays that enable operations such as transformation, comparison, and generation. Latent spaces, I believe, are particularly important. The theory of images, visual culture, and contemporary artistic practices today needs a theory of latent spaces. In a historical phase in which images are more and more captured, generated, modified, stored, transmitted, and described through different kinds of AI models, we need to understand the crucial role played by an abstract mathematical construct whose cultural and political implications could hardly be overestimated. Compression and vectorizations are also key operations in the production of latent spaces. The pervasive presence of AI models across contemporary societies introduces a vast process of vectorization of culture, which has vast epistemic and political implications. This profoundly transforms how the past, meaning the vast quantities of digitized objects stored across the internet as a result of more than 30 years of digital culture, is analyzed, processed, and visualized. Now, it would be a mistake to think that compression, vectorization, and latent spaces operate in the same way across all the different analytic and generative AI models that are producing these transformations. Models such as convolutional neural networks, invented in one of their versions in 2012, variational autoencoders, 2013, generative adversarial networks, 2014, CLIP, 2021, and diffusion models, 2022. Without going into details, I would like to underline that there is not one single latent space, but rather a plurality of distinct latent spaces. Each of them compresses, vectorizes, and encodes in different ways different training data and plays a different role within its model's architecture. This implies that, as Leonardo Impet and Fabian Ostert write in the forthcoming book Vector Media, which has already been presented here, there is no unified latent space of culture, no universal mathematical substrate in which all cultural objects are uniformly encoded, nor a unified digital space such as the internet in its current form. Each latent space compresses and operationalizes different subsets of cultural materials, which in turn conditions its analytic or generative potential. And as Kate Crawford writes in her response to the questionnaire on art and machine learning that was published in the journal October a year and a half ago, I quote her, "All the content in latent space comes from the training data. So the data becomes the Weltanschauung of the model. It sets the parameters of the possible." The field of AI, in other words, in its current form, is a contested ground in which AI models compete for dominance and hegemony. Each of them tends also to impose its own relation with the archive. But what kind of archive am I referring to? The term, as we all here know well, is conceptually loaded and polysemic, carrying multiple meanings that are often conflated. In the book project I'm currently working on, I try to distinguish between three different understandings, though intertwined, of the archive. First, the archive as a technical apparatus for the storage, preservation, and retrieval of historical traces inscribed on material supports. Then, the archive as an institutional apparatus, endowed with some kind of power and authority that selects and filters, includes and excludes, managing access and retrieval to catalogs, indexes, and metadata. Finally, the archive as an epistemological apparatus in Foucauldian terms, not a repository of documents, but rather, to quote Foucault in the Archaeology of Knowledge, a general system of the formation and transformation statements. It's a shifting historical a priori of discourse and enunciability that governs what can and cannot be said, visualized, thought, or known at a given moment in time. These three dimensions, technical, institutional, epistemological, have never been static, of course. Each has evolved alongside the media technologies that sustain them. Together, I believe they allow us to understand the historical transformations and the current orientation of the archive under the pressure of deep learning AI models. The latent spaces of both generative and analytic AI models are part of the long and complex genealogy of the archive. Acting as meta-archives, operating on areas of the vast, messy archive on the internet, compressing them and turning them into vectors, latent spaces introduce a new operational layer in the technical mediation between the past, the present, and the future, reshaping the very conditions for which history is produced, analyzed, and explored. The relations with the three dimensions of the archive are complex and need to be unpacked, since they involve both similarities and differences, which I can only summarize briefly. Here, I try to do some comparison, and bear with this is the last dense section of the paper before I come to my conclusion. If we compare latent spaces with the first two understandings of the archive, the technical and the institutional, I believe that we can find both analogies and differences. First, the analogies. Just like traditional archives, latent spaces act as technical structures of storage, ordering, and transmission. And just like traditional archives, latent spaces operate through selection and exclusion, since compression and vectorization preserve certain traits while erasing others. They are spaces of tension between presence and absence, remembering and forgetting. And what is encoded in them is preserved, while what falls outside the matrix of latent space or representations, vectors, falls into computational media. Now the differences. Unlike traditional archives, latent spaces are generated according to non-human algorithmic logics of compression, vectorization, and embedding. Logics that are profoundly different from those that have historically governed the constitution of traditional archives. Unlike traditional archives, latent spaces are not collections of material artifacts, nor of digital files or representing material artifacts. They are abstract mathematical spaces composed of vectors. And unlike traditional archives, latent spaces, and here I speak in particular of the latent spaces of generative AI models, are not meant for preservation and retrieval, but rather for transformation. They do not store, organize, and preserve historical artifacts in order to render them more or less accessible in time. Instead, they turn digital objects into vectors among which relations can be computed and interpolated, generating new statistically possible objects. If instead we compare latent spaces with the archive as an epistemological apparatus, the archive in the Foucauldian sense, here I believe the analogies prevail over the differences. A new kind of archaeology of knowledge today would inevitably have to engage with AI models and their latent spaces as a new kind of technical and historical a priori, since the dominant analytic and generative AI models, together with their latent spaces, profoundly influence the distinctions between what can and what cannot be written or visualized, while at the same time reorganizing the relations between texts and images. Just as the archive in the Foucauldian sense of the term, latent spaces are at the same time generative and restrictive. They establish conditions of visibility and seeability while introducing boundaries, restrictions, and different forms of censorship. Now, in the very last part, let me go to the artists. Let me go back to the artists whose work, in whose work I find this new kind of archival impulse at play. One that tackles not so much the archive as a material, technical, and institutional entity, but rather the latent spaces of AI models at meta-art. What we find in the works of these artists are visualization of possible pasts, counterfactual histories, synthetic archaeologies, fictional memories, missing images of historical events that were never visually recorded, alternative views of recorded events, or speculative meditations on the becoming of time and the archive in the age of generative AI. Many of these artists are actually actively engaged themselves in theorizing their own approach to AI. And in several cases, they refer directly to the question of the archive and its current transformations. In a text closely connected to his installation, The Fourth Memory, for example, Gregory Chatonsky, together with the media philosopher Yves Citon, theorizes the idea that generated images are the product of what he calls the fourth memory, which has been trained with vast quantities of third memory or tertiary retention, a concept they both derive from the writings of Bernard Stiegler and for his idea of tertiary retention, the kind of memory that is inscribed on material supports such as vinyl disc, photosensitive film, or the hard drive of compute. In his book Cinéma Vivant, closely related to his image series with the same title, Eric Quinlot sees in generative AI models the possibility of visualizing images whose temporal status is that of, I quote him, a past conditional that allows to imagine forgotten utopias as a speculative archive. A reference to the archive can be found also in Pierre Cassou-Nogues's and Will Ravagon's Les Images Pyromanes, Théorie-Fiction des IA Génératives, published just a few months ago. A book which gathers the idea elaborated by the two of them in the context of their experimentations with generative AI for films such as Chronique du Soleil Noir or Au bord du temps, at the edge of time, from which comes the image you see on the right. Here, the latent spaces of generative AI models are described as archives, capable of visualizing parallel stories in the past and future. In this archive, as they write, and I quote them, multiple versions of events, multiple versions of reality coexist with the constant intertwining of anachronism and anarchy. Yet another perspective can be found in an essay published by the filmmaker Kevin Billy with the title Seeing Without Seeing Towards a Generative Archival Practice, a text which is closely connected to his recent film Afterlives, released just a few months ago. In the essay, Lee describes a new kind of archival practice which consists in a study of the ways in which generative AI models are shaping the memory of what he calls the darker instances of history, war crimes, atrocities, and other human rights violations, such as ISIS executions, acting as a new algorithmic filtering process. Basically, EPMBD was interested in trying to understand what happened of all these images of ISIS executions that circulated virally on the internet before disappearing completely because of different kind of content moderation and censorship. Now, these images cannot be found anymore, but traces of them somehow have been encoded within latent spaces of generative AI. They reappear when you prompt, like ISIS execution out of these models. They keep on reappearing in constantly different ways, depending on the evolution of the model, depending on the moment in time. they are always somehow sanitized and clean of the most horrific elements. We do not see blood, we do not see decapitation, but you see scenes that somehow evoke those kind of scenes. And so he sees in generative AI models a very interesting and problematic form of preservation of cultural memory of events that have been deleted out of the internet. And we can probably imagine that the same fate will happen for the images of Charlie Kirk's assassination, which have circulated virally all across the internet. They are probably going to disappear sooner or later. And again, traces of them somehow will remain in generative AI. And this could be the case for many of the highly traumatic historical events that we're facing. So what Kevin Billy does is to try to theorize this new kind of generative archival practice, which interrogates the role of these models as preservers and at the same time effacers of the. And the last example I would like to mention briefly before coming to my conclusion is the one of the German filmmaker Alexander Kluge, who started producing short AI-generated stills using mostly stable diffusion in 2023 at the age of 91 years old. In a recently published book, which came out with a very, very interesting German title, The Cognitive Picture, and a much less interesting English title, The Dragonfly's Eyes, Kluge uses this notion, conjunctive der Bilder, visual subjunctive or subjunctive of images, to describe what he calls, and I quote him, the grammatical mode of our sense of what is possible, the specific modality of images used to visualize hypotheticals and heterotopias. Basically, images generated by AI for Kluge are not images in the indicative mode, they are images in the subjunctive mode, images of the order of the as if for what is and so on. So I come finally to my conclusion. Artistic projects such as the ones I just presented, I believe, help us understand the new layer of algorithmic mediation that AI technologies are introducing in our relation with the past. They allow us to grasp the new conditions of historicity, of becoming historical in the age of generative AI. We're currently in a phase in which both analytic and generative AI systems are penetrating across all layers of culture and society, transforming the ways in which we think, we imagine, and we remember. AI is introducing a new layer in our relation with the past, and authoritarian governments here in the US and elsewhere are taking advantage of this situation. Here in the US, I'm thinking in particular of the month of February, word search-based suppression of documents enacted by the Trump administration, with a list of words that had to be suppressed from federal documents and websites. And one of them, at least if we refer to the list published by the New York Times in February, was, you see the term historically. We can discuss later what this means. But historically, together with terms such as gender, queer, LGBTQ, and so on, was targeted as a term to be removed. Perhaps with the idea that one of the first steps in installing an authoritarian governments is to evacuate alternative, different visions of history in order to impose a dominant historical narrative. I'm also thinking about the political uses of AI right now here in the US, of the deepfake video portraits of the Founders Museum, created by the company PragerU, that you can see there, and recently opened next to the White House. Videos in which we see some of the founding fathers, such as John Adams, giving speeches that are not based on historical records, but rather containing invented phrases such as "facts don't care about your feelings." The phrase that was never uttered by John Adams, but rather comes from speeches by the far-right political commentator Ben Shapiro, He used it so often that it became the title for one of his books. Now, within this troubling political landscape, in which we see all these uses of AI to produce a technically distorted version of history, a landscape in which also major AI companies right now are perfectly aligned with the current administration. Understanding and exploring latent spaces as meta-archives, I think, is not merely an analytical exercise, but a political imperative. These compressed vector spaces are becoming the primary sites for which cultural memory is stored, accessed, and generated. They are the filters through which the past is interpreted and transmitted, and we cannot hand this process over to a handful of proprietary AI models run by tech oligarchs. Whether explicitly political or more speculative, the artworks I mentioned today can be interpreted, I think, as small but significant acts of resistance. They can be interpreted as artistic explorations that help us to preserve the archive, even in its most abstract mathematical form, as a site of critical exploration rather than algorithmic experiment. Thank you so much.